Okay, wonderful. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Open Democracy's live discussion about Russia's war and the fight for climate justice. My name is Tom Rowley. I'm an editor of Open Democracy, where I cover Ukraine, Russia, and the wider region. And I'm joined tonight with some absolutely fantastic panelists, and really happy that they've agreed to join us and to kind of hash through some of these kind of very important issues. And I'm also really happy to see everybody joining us online on Zoom. And I'm looking forward to dealing and trying to address some of your questions. I know some people have addressed the questions ahead of time, and we'll certainly get to those. And if you do have questions during the event, we'll try and get to them as best we can. So let me just go to our next part. I think maybe I'll just introduce our panelists first off. First of all, we have Oleh Savitskyi, who is a campaign manager at the Stand With Ukraine initiative, which campaigns for an end to the purchase of Russian fossil fuels. We have Simon Pirani, who is an oil and gas analyst and the author of Burning Up, A Global History of Fossil Fuel Consumption in 2018, a fantastic book, highly recommend it. And we have Angelina Davydova, who is a Russian climate journalist, environmental expert with a huge amount of experience. Really glad to have Angelina with us today. I'm just going to say a few words to kind of set up our conversation, and then I'm going to move to our panelists, who I've asked to say roughly 90 seconds or to 2 minutes of reflections on this theme, the theme of our conversation this evening, to kind of kick us off, because I think it's such a wide-ranging theme, and everyone has such a an important perspective that I just want to capture that right at the beginning. So I'll just say a few words just to kick us off, and that is that, just in case anybody had forgotten, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused thousands of deaths and revealed the fragility of the international order. Millions of people have been displaced inside the country and outside it, as it has fought for its very existence against Russian aggression. This war has also come at a key time for the fight against climate change and fossil fuels, and it should be said that the latter power the Russian war machine, with estimates that oil and gas exports make up to 40% of Russian state budget revenues. So we're dealing with an incredibly complicated and tragic situation that kind of connects both economic dependency, climate breakdown, and an ongoing situation in Ukraine that at the European level is kind of forcing Europe to deal with finding new sources of fossil fuels and potentially alternative sources, as there's greater pressure to move away from them. And I think for many observers, I think perhaps people not in the policy and the journalism world or whatever, there's a sense of being pulled in two directions. On the one hand, there's the idea that Russia's aggression could derail climate change efforts and efforts to combat it, and others think that it could speed them up. And I don't think we're going to find, I'm not sure if we're going to find a consensus on those issues today, but I think that kind of perhaps that at a very basic level is an accurate description of the debate. But I look forward to seeing what our panelists say in response to that. That's certainly not an expert view. For our first panelist, and this is just a sort of 90-second, 2-minute reflection, I'd like to go to Simon, and then we'll go to Oleh, and then we'll go to Angelina, if that's okay. Simon, please kick us off.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. As a result of the war, the Russian gas trade with Europe is breaking down, and Russian oil and gas output is falling over the longer term. So 3 points from me about the policy response by the governments of rich Western countries that consume most of the fossil fuels that are exported from Russia. First, political leaders are focusing on replacing Russian oil and gas with supplies from elsewhere. This undermines all the promises they've made at international climate talks. So here in the UK, just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the go-ahead was given for a new oil field, Jackdaw, operated by Shell, when we know that tackling climate change means there can be no new oil fields in rich countries such as this one. Second, the focus on supplies undermines efforts to deal with the really urgent issue from a climate point of view to reduce permanently the throughput of energy made from fossil fuels through the big technological systems that society uses. So to give an example, a large share of the gas consumed in Europe is used for home heating to raise the temperature of people's homes by a few degrees. this is a waste of resources from an engineering point of view. There are simple technologies that have existed for decades to heat people's homes differently, properly insulating them, heat pumps, district heating systems, and so on. The gas shortages associated with Russia's aggression should be tackled in the first place by ramping up these low energy technologies. But that's not where the governments are at the moment. The third point is the war has disrupted energy markets, and that has hit millions of households in the form of gigantic rises in energy bills. By October here in the UK, most people's energy bills will be more than double what they were at the beginning of the year. In my view, in social movements, policies to defend households from the unbearable effect of these bills, to defend those who cannot pay these bills, must go hand in hand with policies to tackle the climate crisis. So programs of home insulation, as I mentioned, support for public transport instead of cars, and so on. And as we're increasingly hearing from social movements, underlining that the end of the week, the end of the world is the same fight, not two different fights. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Simon, for kicking us off. Oleh, could you join us, please?
Yeah, so reflecting on your last point, whether this is a situation that can disrupt climate action or actually speed up climate action, I would say that we are at an inflection point, because the war, the Russia's aggression, it's basically shattered everything. It shattered the international order. It shattered legal basis for international peace. It shattered all kinds of international policies and climate policy as well. So the real outcome of this war will be very significant for the whole world. If Russia will not be defeated in a complete way, and the Putin's regime will not be dismantled, I fear very much that we will not be able to achieve any climate action progress in the coming decade, because you cannot act on climate without reducing the reliance on fossil fuels, and without dismantling the political and economic power of the fossil fuel industry. And Putin is actually a linchpin of this power. He was created, and he is a child of fossil fuel CEOs. His best friend is Rex Tillerson. So the Putin is actually is the offspring of oil and gas, and their fate is very, very narrowly tied. If we end Putin's regime, it will also be a huge blow to the fossil fuel industry globally.
Thanks very much, Oleh. Really important points there. Angelina, could I bring you in for this kind of first sort of 90-second, 2-minute reflection, just to kick everything off?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. I will start my intervention by saying a few words about myself. So, as Tom has pointed out, I've been indeed covering Russia's and international climate policy and actions for many years by now. And in mid-March, I decided to leave Russia because of the war and my anti-war position and increasing difficulties of working in Russia as an independent journalist. So I'm based in Berlin now. Ever since the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I've been trying to follow the environmental and climate impacts of the war, concentrating mainly on the following issues. On one hand, how the war and connected sanctions and connected embargoes influencing Russia's climate and environmental policy. So what happens within Russia? And on another hand, I've also been trying to follow on what is happening at the global level, with the global climate agenda, with the global energy balance, issues of food security. So I've been mainly trying to concentrate on these two aspects. And in order to try and stay within the 2 minutes limit, I would very briefly outline saying that in short, Russia still remains to be world's 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter, officially still part of the Paris Agreement, and climate issues remain in the official agenda. That's the wording, so to say. But when we really do take a look at what's happening in the actions, we actually do see quite a lot of rollback of environmental and climate legislation in Russia. So it's really an open question what happens later. And likewise, what we also observe is that many like large oil, gas, and other companies, including like very large polluters of the metal industry and other industries, they're trying to push back even further rollback of climate regulation and standards and certification in the country, saying that the economic conditions are so difficult, so we have to get some sort of benefits at the moment and maybe being able to pollute even more in current economic conditions. And likewise, consume even more oil and gas and coal within Russia, all this in all these volumes that we cannot sell abroad. I'll probably stop here, and I'll be happy to comment more on that and also engage in further conversations with the fellow panelists.
Thanks very much, Angelina, and thanks very much, Oleh and Simon, for your initial comments as well. As ever, as we discussed, particularly Simon and Oleh, this conversation has been pitched incredibly broadly, and that's both a blessing and a curse. But I just want to try and sum up one kind of initial question from all three of your remarks, because there's a lot in here. On the one hand, for example, Angelina just talked about rollback on kind of climate and environmental goals and the accountability of that at home in Russia as it continues to prosecute its war against Ukraine. Oleh, you've talked about the fact that Putin is essentially a child of the fossil fuel industry, which obviously raises direct questions about the nature of this war. And Simon, you've talked about this conundrum between, on the one hand, short-term supplies and the long-term kind of consequences of having technological and economic systems that are based on fossil fuels. I wonder, I feel like, because we're still at the beginning of this conversation, I feel like we should potentially tackle this question of Putin as this kind of child of the fossil fuel industry and what that reveals about the war as it stands now. Because I feel like we should deal with this right at the beginning of this discussion. And I'd like to bring in Simon. This is Oleh's point, but I'd like to bring in Simon on this because Simon also has a background as a historian and a political analyst of Russia, if that's okay.
I mean, at the beginning of the war, or that's wrong. At the beginning of this invasion, this chapter of the war in February, I wrote an article saying, and I had a strong opinion, that Putin was to a large extent sacrificing the aims of economic management in order to pursue this kind of neo-colonial adventure against Ukraine. It was very clear. I mean, this happened in 2014. The sanctions were imposed as a result of the annexation of Crimea, and every Russian businessman, and it is mostly men, hated that because it prevented any progress in terms of the recovery from the 28-9 economic crisis in business in Russia. And the invasion this year has made conditions, of course, for those Russian companies much worse, and the flow of investment into Russia is affected. I mean, it'd be interesting to know what the other panelists think, but I mean, the fact that the Western oil companies stated their intention, at least, to pull out of Russia was a remarkable change. There was a remarkable change in German policy. I have to say, though, since then, what we've seen, I think, from the Western powers is a very cynical kind of clawing back from some quarters to try to retain what can be retained of the relationship with Russia, while at the same time giving the appearance of supporting Ukraine. I think we see that in the discussions in the European Union about gas, but not only there. We see it in many ways. And of course, here in the UK, we see it because while our government has certainly talked the loudest about sanctions and so on, the number of Russian oligarchs and insiders who clearly support and are part of the nexus between Putin and the oil industry, and who have their ill-gotten gains stashed away in the London property market, remains very high. And of course, we get a speech from a cabinet minister every time one more person is added to the sanctions list. But the sanctions list here of those individuals is far, far shorter than in the States or in the EU.
Thanks very much, Simon. Oleh, I think it makes sense just to bring you in here because of your campaigning work regarding fossil fuels and the war. Just to kind of wrap up Simon's comments, could you just add something on that, please? That'd be wonderful.
Yeah. So would like just to add to that Putin's closest circle is not really vulnerable to sanctions and international action. They were preparing for this war, and they are not much vulnerable, really. And what happens now is we see that the profits of Russia for sales of oil and gas, they have skyrocketed even as the actual delivery volumes have dropped, just because the war caused the upheaval in international energy markets, and Russia has weaponized the gas supplies to Europe, cutting them to a minimal level and creating this deficit, which benefits them through the price spike. This, if we return to the initial point, what will happen with the climate policy? I see a real danger that in the worst case scenario, the world may go into the age of a new petro-colonialism. And Putin's war is a actual gate to hell if we really can stop him. The other petro dictators will follow and use their control over fossil fuel supplies as a means to have financial and political and military leverages for their contests and for their aggression in other parts of the world. And this can be a real end game for humanity if the world goes down this road.
Thanks very much, Oleh. I feel we've now entered into the particularly apocalyptic stage of our conversation, which is still in its early stages. Could I just thank our other panelists, Angelina, Simon? I mean, does that picture painted by Oleh of this kind of growing power of kind of essentially petro dictatorships and the threats they've posed to kind of global security, both on the climate change front and of course immediately in terms of potential military aggression, etc. Does that? I mean, I feel like that's almost a separate conversation, but I just wanted to grab a quick reflection on you, because I feel it's something that requires some reflection.
Well, I've kind of been seeing a number of articles recently which were having the main argument that the war could actually have been even caused by the whole structure of this petro dictatorship, and even with further interests for fossil fuels and other resources in Ukraine. I have to say, I'm not fully convinced by that. I realize even calling Russia a pure petro dictatorship is somewhat complicated. It's a complicated issue for me. I'm someone who's been following the climate and the energy debate in Russia for the last 15 years. And to me, it falls into separate boxes. So in one box, we would have Russia's imperialistic ambitions, which are being realized now in the form of Ukraine. And that box, in a way, was using the resources of other boxes, predominantly oil and gas and coal, but not only. We can also speak about metals, we can speak about steel and aluminium and timber and many other products. So it's been using those resources to, to train its power, to play with the muscles, and to show the power on international markets. Like, we cut off gas supplies and then we'll see how you will deal on a cold winter with that kind of argument. But I still feel like the motivation for this particular war is predominantly not connected with the fossil fuels. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'll prove to be wrong in half a year. I still feel like that geopolitical ambitions and this historical imperialistic ambitions, the ones we were also speaking in the beginning, play much larger role. And then fossil fuels are just being instrumentalized as resources. To support this argument, I will give you two following examples. One example would be, we've been talking about the role that Russian oil and gas companies played in supporting the regime, but in a way, they were also, in the last 2 years, which were trying to build into the whole new structure of decarbonizing world. For example, we could see how Gazprom and Novatek, Russia's leading gas companies, were drafting their low carbon development plans, just like any other gas majors elsewhere. And we're putting a lot of hope into hydrogen, or blue hydrogen or other kind of hydrogen production. Likewise, with oil company, Rosneft and Lukoil were having exactly the same beautiful reports, just like Total and many other companies were having. So in a way, I would not say they were a particular risk. At least they realize how they can play with it and how they can also make profits even in this new world. So in a way, I almost have a feeling they represent the kind of Russia's elites who are not particularly happy with the war taking place. Well, I can certainly say for quite a lot of people from the gas industry in particular, and also many other like metal industries and many others, who are absolutely not happy with the war, because that meant completely new conditions for them and ruin of everything which they did in the last years, regardless of the way we treat it and whether they think it was moral, it was ethical, it was not ethical. So I almost feel like if we speak about elites who do support the war, those who are mainly not business elites and not companies elites, who are actually pushed away from the Kremlin as soon as the war started. It would rather elites from the security services, the army, and many other groups, but not the financial and economic elites.
I think this is thanks very much, Angelina. I think there's some really important points about the kind of the structure of power at the very top of the kind of Russian political system. But I think this is a good point to just also just to have a quick update. And I'm actually going to go to Simon on this. Quick update on the state of play with regards to Europe's kind of dependency on fossil fuels from Russia, because I know that you have been following this, and just to set the scene for our listeners, just because I think that will be a useful kind of factual break in our conversation.
Okay, unless you stop me, Tom, I'm just going to say very quickly what was on my mind in response to Angelina, which is that I agree. There's a real, I said before, I mean, there is a real contradiction, I think, between the aims of managing the Russian economy and what's good for business and this war, because clearly the sanctions were going to come down. Clearly the oil companies were going to have to react, the Western oil companies, and clearly it was going to be bad for business, even worse than Crimea. So, I mean, I think, yes, there's that. Where I'm a little more skeptical, and we may not be able to discuss it right now in detail. I mean, I take those glossy brochures from Russian companies about the wonderful steps they're making on environmental issues, the same as I would the same glossy brochures from companies anywhere else. In other words, it's not just a pinch of salt. I mean, it's a massive rock of salt. And so as for hydrogen being something green, I think that's another. I mean, this may be something we can come back to, but the short answer from me is it's not. As for Europe and the dependence on Russian gas, I saw a very good report from an NGO, the name of which I've forgotten. That's what happens to you when you get to my stage in life. But it's where Laurie Miller-Verta works, who follows China very thoroughly. And they put out a report just in June, sort of, where have we got to? Or a couple of reports. I mean, one said that the policy is shifting. I mean, to me, these are micro shifts, announcements of a bit more money for renewables here, announcements for a bit of progress on the buildings and these areas where, by the way, you could make very, very rapid steps very quickly. Then they also did an accompanying report on the reduction of fossil fuel purchases, and it looks pretty thin. I mean, the European Commission said we're going to decrease the imports of Russian gas into Europe by 2/3. Now, in 2021, we were talking about 150 something billion cubic meters of gas. So they're talking about reducing by 100 billion cubic meters by the end of this year. I don't see that happening, not the speed they're going with it at the moment. It's sloping down gradually, whereas it should be falling.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Simon. I mean, Oleh, just because you're very close to this issue with your campaigning, I feel like it's wise just to bring you in, here. And then I would just encourage our listeners, if you do have any questions on what our panelists have said so far, or maybe what they haven't said, or something that you'd like to know, please dive in with your questions as well.
Yes, the Simon's observation is very correct. Actually, the decline in the Russian fossil fuels supplies to Europe is nowhere near to what was previously announced by European Commission. And ahead of winter, the fear is that Europe will have energy crisis and deficit. And this fear is and panic is being blown up by the industrial consumers of gas, for which gas is an essential part of their business and is their profit on their products, such as pharmaceuticals, plastics, chemical industry, glass, and they all heavily depend on gas. And they mostly produce non-essential goods, and they could just postpone production or limit production or shift production to their factories in other parts of the world. But they prefer not to do so, and they are willing to lobby the national governments against any significant reductions in fossil fuel supplies, in particular gas supplies from Russia. And this is a huge problem, and we see it explicitly in the new communication from the European Commission, which was released just yesterday. And basically, if you can read and analyze the document, it's actually a green light for lobbying the national governments for the industry, because it doesn't contain any specific guide or mechanism on how to reduce industrial gas consumption. It all lives, this whole realm is left for national governments to decide actually with industries and their lobbies. And this will not actually play a good result out. And the important thing is this puts actually us Ukrainians and vulnerable Europeans on the chopping block this winter, because Europe's energy security depends on the ability to fill gas storage now in the summer and maybe in the first months of the autumn, because in the winter we will need gas for heating, And now the industrial consumers are the main consumers of gas. So if they don't reduce gas demand now when Russian supplies are limited, Europe will definitely have gas shortages, and people will get huge costs of living spikes and bills for heating, which are 3 or 4 times bigger than previous year. So actually, this is something which exposed the real face of many industries, that they are willing to place profit over people at massive and sometimes even genocidal cost.
Thanks very much, Oleh. I've just been informed that there is something going on with the chat. So I believe that we can't actually currently receive questions via the chat from you, our audience. So I think we're trying to figure that out. But in the meantime, you can use the Q&A function if you do want to ask questions. So please do use the Q&A function if you can't access the chat. There are questions about what our panelists have said and or anything else, and we'll see if we can get to them. And actually on that note, I would actually like to just go to some of the questions that were sent ahead of time from audience members who signed up. And I think I'm going to go to a very specific one, which I think I'm going to see if Angelina can help us with, if that's all right. And I'm sorry to spring this on you, Angelina, but I suspect you might know the answer. And if not, perhaps one of our other panelists will, which is how does the start of the war, how does the start of Russia's war against Ukraine align with the IPCC calls for restrictions on fossil fuel burning? And if anybody doesn't know, IPCC refers to Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I think that just to restate the question, because so basically, how does the start of the war align with calls for IPCC calls for restriction on fossil fuel burning? I don't know if you can help us answer that question.
Sorry, just let me rephrase it. Do I get it right? So the question is whether Russia's invasion of Ukraine in any way aligns with the IPCC recommendations to bring down our emissions?
I believe that is the question, which on second reading is a slightly perhaps cynical. Maybe cynical. It may not be, but it just
doesn't look connected in any way with me. And unfortunately, maybe it's also the time that we should comment on the way the global climate agenda and global climate actions are actually changing because of this war. And we see that most of the consequences of the war, direct and indirect impact of the war, is actually not really beneficial for the global climate. And it doesn't bring us to any better stage in terms of emission reduction in comparison to what we had before February 24th. And I think it relies a lot to what Simon and Oleh have been saying before. I would just like to reconfirm that unfortunately what we see is that, yes, on one hand, there is lesser demand and there is more demand for fossil embargoes on fossil fuels from Russia, and many countries have introduced it, and there are plans to introduce even further. However, at the same time, what we also see, on one hand, many former importers of Russian coal, gas, and oil just switch to other suppliers, or thinking in terms of switching to other, well, hopefully short-term fossil fuel energy solutions. And then in the long term, I very much hope, and I think my co-panelists also hope that in the long term, that actually means, that does mean decarbonization, and that does mean leaving the sector of the fossil fuel in general, actually going away from just a handful of fossil fuel producers, which make the whole world very much dependent on their political system and their idiosyncratic behavior. But in the short term, yes, unfortunately, that's not good news. And also, most of the oil which Russia does not sell to European Union or other countries, it actually sells in larger quantities to China, to India, and to Turkey. This is what we've also been observing in the last few months. And then in some cases, India is actually reselling it to other countries, including some European Union countries. The oil is not a very easy commodity to actually track the origin of and prove the origin of. So unfortunately, there have been such cases. And the very last argument that, as I mentioned at the beginning, the abundance of oil and oil products, which is actually taking place now in Russia, and which we observe in Russia, leads to the fact that, for example, oil companies are pushing for the energy sector to be switched back to heavy oil instead of natural gas, which also is obviously not good news for global climate. And also, oil companies have been pushing for allowing them to actually burn flaring gas again. That's the very environmentally and climate damaging practice, the one they've been doing in the 90s and earlier. So unfortunately, at least in the short term, it's not connected at all.
Thanks very much, Angelina, for responding to that question. I think that's important. Oleh, I see a hand up, so please go ahead. I mean, if you could keep it brief, Oleh, just that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I will try to keep it brief, but I have a different view on this. There may be no explicit or conscious connection between this fossil-fueled war and the major scientific report, which is a code red for humanity, as said by the Secretary General of United Nations. So at the same time as the world is faced with immense need to cut fossil fuel production, not just burning, but we need to address the core of the problem, which is actually production of fossil fuels. You cannot address the climate crisis without phasing out fossil fuels completely. So all the false agendas about carbon neutral technologies or carbon capture and storage, they were present for decades just to derail real climate action. And the real solution is phasing out fossil fuels. And when it becomes clear that the fossil fuel industry should be regulated, that their power and profits should be taken away by the governments, suddenly the situation appears when everything is just being blown up and the whole world is is not bothered anymore about climate policy in the way it was before. The war is a last resort of the perpetrators and the fossil fuel industry behind Putin. They are actually benefiting now the current situation because they now can go to Africa, they can go to other parts of the world to make further fossil fuel extraction projects. And this is the law. It's not a conscious decision, but it's an economic logic of the fossil fuel industry. This is genocidal industry, and they will not stop if they are not stopped.
Thanks very much, Oleh. I feel like I would probably do injustice to the complexities of the arguments presented by you and Angelina here, but I think just to draw out that there's definitely a difference in the view of the nature of the fossil fuels industry support or entanglement in Russia's war against Ukraine here. So just to flag that to our listeners. We have a question which I believe Simon has volunteered for from our audience, which is from Michael Sinclair. Thanks very much, Michael, for offering your question. I'm just going to cut the top off, and it says, it is astonishing how the West has built a reliance for fuels under these circumstances where Putin is the president of one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals. The zero emission policies that many countries are following have come at the worst time in conjunction with this invasion, as they themselves are hugely costly. What is the panel's view? Simon, you have to an extent volunteered for this question. So if you could help me, Michael, and the rest of our viewers figure it out.
Tom, so just before I go on to that, somebody else asked what was the name of that NGO that my old brain had forgotten. It's the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. I typed that into the Q&A, but I also fluffed that up, which is also an age-related thing. So Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, and Lori Miliverta, who's one of the lead researchers there, is a fantastic expert on China. Can't recommend their stuff too highly. So moving on to the question of the I think we just, I take your point, Michael, and I think we need to challenge, and we need to challenge the idea that climate measures are necessarily expensive, because that is not the case. So we have here in the UK, just to demonstrate my affection for our lovely government, I'm going to criticize them again. We've got the leadership battle going on at the moment, and Liz Truss, who's pretty likely to come out on top, she said, oh, I would stop the green levy on people's energy bills. It's a completely kind of populist thing. Most people's energy bills in this country, so measured in pounds, the green levy is £215, but like £1,500 has been added to those bills as a result of A, the volatility of the energy markets, and B, the particularly cruel way that the electricity market and gas markets are dumped onto the retail users in this country. So all this stuff is very, very political, and clearly the cost. I mean, the government has been savaged by its own pretty tame, I have to say, climate change committee. A few weeks ago, they produced a massive 600 and something page report on all this, and savaged the government about its failure for years and years and years to get going with the home insulation, which is such an obvious cost saving for the people in their homes, cost saving for the authorities, cost saving for the energy companies, cost saving for everybody, and they refuse to get on with it. So again, that's about the politics of neoliberalism and market solutions for everything. And I mean, to give one more example, here in London, we're fighting with the mayor of London about his plan to spend £2 billion on a new crossing under the Thames, which will benefit trucks, it will benefit cars, but it will not benefit people. And of course, the finances of the public transport, which are settled not only by the mayor, but by the government, are tweaked in such a way as that public transport is really expensive. At least we've got it in London, which is more than you can say for a lot of parts of northern England and Scotland. Instead of so again, there's another example to come to Michael's point. I mean, investment in public transport could be a massive way of reducing the bloated car industry and the expense that people have to go to in using cars. But of course, that would come up against corporate interests. So at every turn, these things are political. And I just think, yes, of course, I mean, some climate measures are expensive, right? Turning the electricity system upside down, which is going to have to happen at some time in the next few decades, that's going to be expensive. But let's not fall into the trap of accepting what are usually completely political arguments about green costs too much, which is what we're hearing from the right.
Thanks very much, Simon. And I feel just this might be slightly kind of inside baseball, as they say, but I feel that Simon should also reveal that he's a member of a campaign that happens to be campaigning against this tunnel that he mentioned. I mean, I'm not trying to put you on the spot there, but you are. So that just to mention that to our panelists and indeed our audience. The chat is now working. So I just want to encourage our listeners and viewers once again, just to pop any of your questions in the chat. We do have around 15 to 20 minutes left. So I think this is really a key time just to get any of your questions in now. But in terms of our conversation so far, Angelina, Oleh, Simon, obviously we're dealing with such a number of issues here. Is there something that you feel that we haven't kind of dealt with yet? Or is there something that is lurking in the background that we should be dealing with? Oleh, you put your hand directly up, so I feel like I should go to you, but I would also like to bring in Angelina very quickly at some point.
Okay, yeah, just to keep track on the topic, will we manage to have a real climate action this decade? This depends on how we perceive the fossil fuel industry. Before, they were able to get away with anything, and they were basically derailing the climate policy successfully for decades. And you cannot even find a single word fossil fuels in the text of the Paris Agreement, or coal, oil, and gas. There are now no such words in the Paris Agreement, and this is no coincidence. To really have an exit from this crisis towards a livable future, towards planetary boundaries of environmental sustainability, and just for a decent world, we need to rethink climate policy completely and start addressing the core of the problem, and this is fossil fuel extraction. And this demands what is called the supply side climate policy. When you regulate fossil fuel extraction, when you stop what was happening for decades, when and this is paradox. Many constitutions of the world say that natural resources belong to the people, to all people of countries. But in reality, it happens that very few people, sometimes which can be counted on the fingers of one hand, control all the fossil fuel reserves of the country and have such concentration of profits and power that they can do what Putin does today. So it's about regulating fossil fuels and returning the resource use under the very strict regulation of the governments, also on international level. So we need to have a global stock take, not of carbon emissions, but global stock take of fossil fuel extraction. This is the only way to solve the climate crisis.
Thanks very much, Oleh. I mean, Angelina, I feel like it seems very relevant to bring you in here as a long-time observer and reporter on kind of international climate policy, COPs, etc. I feel like you're absolutely great to have your reflections on that. And I see some people have also, sorry, before we go to you, Angelina, I see some of our listeners and viewers are in fact asking questions, including via YouTube. Thanks very much for your questions. We'll try and get to them.
Shall I also address some of the questions? I'm just looking at what have been printed in the chat. I cannot hear you, Thomas.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I think if one question jumps out to you as something that you can really answer, that would be wonderful. But I think we were going to try and bring you in as a long-time observer
okay. All right. Yeah.
processes and international climate policy, just to kind of tie up with what Oleh just said.
Well, I have to say, in mid-June, I went to the first ever UN session, like UN negotiation session on climate in Bonn, Germany. That was something which is called intersessional, so is not as important as the COP, which will take place in Egypt in November this year. And I should say that on one hand, quite a few new problems appeared within the global climate negotiations. Like, I think some of these problems have already been mentioned by my co-panelists and myself, including the fact that there is, well, at least we can say there's a short interest again in investment in fossil fuels and domestic investment in fossil fuels, or changing suppliers, building new routes, building new LNG terminals. And that's unfortunately not a very good trend. Likewise, investment in natural gas and coal, and many countries thinking of going back to nuclear. I don't think it's all good news in current conditions. And another, I would say also negative trend is that especially many developing countries are saying that with so much financial resources are being now redirected to war, and in one way or another, including weapons, including reconstruction efforts, and including many other programs, which obviously make sense in current conditions. Less money will be spent on climate finance and international climate finance. And that's a really big worry, especially in the run-up for the next COP, which will have its main emphasis on climate finance and climate adaptation in the most vulnerable countries and developing countries. So I believe those are the two main problems which appear at the moment and which are being also discussed at the UN level and within the UN community. Yeah, I see time is running out. Just one short point. But on the other hand, just to reinforce what my co-panelists were saying, I would also support an idea that the whole war and everything happening around the war, I would say it just confirms the argument that the world needs to go away from fossil fuels as soon as possible. And to stop supporting very strange political regimes in the countries which have the resources and are using it as blackmail method for the rest of the world. We need to do it. We need to rethink our relationships with fossil fuels in a way, and we need to rethink our energy infrastructure, energy storage, technologies, everyday practices. And we've been speaking for many years about it, and now it's probably that we start dealing with it like straight away.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Angelina. I mean, just to type on your, just to respond to your last point about kind of everyday practice and even kind of much more potentially minor changes, etc., that can be made already at this point that might affect dependency on fossil fuels, etc. I just actually want to post a link in the chat to Simon, our co-panelist's article on this topic, which came out with us earlier in the year, in which I feel like Simon makes a really strong, I mean, I was the editor on the piece, so I'm biased, but like a really important effort to kind of link Russia's war against Ukraine, sanctions and the fossil fuel embargo to Europe's dependence on fossil fuels, cost of living, and more immediate fixes that might help the dependency and kind of carbon emission situation. So I just want to post that in the chat if people have time for that. Angelina, I just want to ask a question, very short question on what you just said, which was, basically you expressed some concerns around there being less money for kind of climate-related financing and so on. Could you just flesh that out really briefly for us? What have you seen in this area that you think people should definitely know about? Are there already signs that there is, sort of less money in the pot on that front? Is that what you're suggesting?
Sorry, did I get a question right? That you are asking about where would that money be directed to if they not be directed to
essentially, yes,
weapons or like kind of economy restoration or any other programs? Well, when we speak about climate finance, we usually speak about the money which go from so-called developed countries, though I'm not super happy with this term, to the so-called developing world, but most importantly, the so-called most vulnerable countries, most vulnerable to climate change countries. And that money is either going for the purposes of the so-called mitigation, which means it helps those countries to reduce their greenhouse emissions with technologies, with investments, with grants, with various kinds of programs. But it also helps those countries adapt to climate change. And as we know, most of the most vulnerable countries are in the global south, and they are particularly vulnerable to climate change. So they're the ones who also need a lot of money for building climate adaptation programs and climate resilience programs, making the urban infrastructure better, more efficient, and also more resilient towards climate change. Is it what you're asking about?
Exactly, that was it.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Angelina. Friends, colleagues, listeners, viewers, we're kind of entering into the twilight stage of our conversation this evening, which I feel is, in retrospect, has been incredibly short. And I feel like we're only, as ever, just beginning to scratch the surface, and we're just warming up. So don't worry, we will finish more or less on time. We all have things to do and so on. But I feel, yes, slightly remorseful that we're just beginning to kind of get into these issues. And I just want to say thanks to our audience members for asking great questions, and thanks to our panelists for offering their insights. I want to take one question from the audience, because we are, it's an interesting one, and I think it's something that maybe some people haven't heard of, and also maybe some of our audience members haven't heard of. And then I would just like to invite our panelists just to kind of think about one thing that you really want to say about this issue, about the interconnection between the climate battle and the war, and Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine, which has obviously displaced millions of people both inside the country and outside the country, and of course incredible damage to the country. But before we get to that, it's a slightly UK kind of home issue, which comes from Alessia Lungi, who brings up a movement in the UK for mass non-payment of energy bills in response to the rise in energy costs. And similar campaigns have also been talked about in Germany, Greece, and Poland and Italy. He says, one blocker for the climate movement has been uniting with people's everyday material needs. Do the panelists see this form of action around energy bills, i.e. non-payment, becoming a means by which climate movement can speak to a wider layer of people. Simon, I think this might be in your area. Could you give a brief response to that? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I would just question whether this is a UK issue. I think it's much broader. I think it relates to something Angelina said before, when I think she was saying that, you know, out of this horrendous crisis, we've got to, you know, that's got to kind of give us a collective shock about humanity's relationship with fossil fuels in a very broad sense. But I think actually what Alessio is talking about is very much the same thing. I mean, these bills are going to shock people. Well, we had another shock, which was the weather this week. And I think that shocked some people. But what is certainly going to shock people is the energy bills in this country in October. They'll hit other countries at other points. And I think this is a chance to break what we've had for so long, which is a kind of tension between environmentalists who are seen as sort of do-gooding people who are middle class and perhaps don't have to worry about how to pay their bills and so on, and who are concerned with protecting nature, which is, you know, not really what environmentalists are like at all, but that's the kind of stereotype. And there is a distance and a tension between them and social movements that are trying to defend ordinary people's living standards, be they trade unions, be they community organizations, and so on and so on. And I think that, you know, out of this awful war, there is an opportunity. And I think that the Don't Pay campaign, Alessio has mentioned, I'm a great fan of it. I think it's a great idea. Look them up on Twitter. And they've got huge support. And they got huge support because people literally can't pay. And I think the idea is to unite those who can't pay with the entire social movement, and to make that social movement completely linked with climate change and demands to do something about climate change, and not allow what is essentially the message from the right of politics, not allow the right to claim that somehow tackling climate change is a sort of minority or niche concern which cannot be bound up with ordinary people's worries about their living standards. I think what the situation we're in now shows is that, yes, if you insulate those homes, if you take those measures, if you do something about the way the electricity market and the gas market works, if you take those drastic measures, which surely are justified in a time of war, if ever, both progress can be made in defending ordinary people's living standards, and progress can be made on climate change at the same time.
Thanks very much, Simon. Oleh, I see you have a hand promptly. I think we're now, because I'm slightly concerned that our Zoom call is going to stop abruptly, with, you know, very rudely, because it's known to happen. Let's put it like that. But I don't. Oh, we've just gone to 6 o'clock, so it's not. It seems like it's not happening, which is a good thing. But I just want to. I also want to enter into our kind of final. We've got until 6:15, so we have 15 more minutes. I also want to enter into our final stage. Oleh, did you have a specific response to what Simon was talking about in terms of the Don't Pay campaign in the UK and of course around Europe, about connecting everyday material needs to the climate battle? Did you have something to say about
that? Yes, just very briefly to support that this is a really issue, the cost of living, which brings together environmental activists and everyone and ordinary people. And this is the time for ordinary people to recognize that their critical needs, the energy supply, cannot be controlled by unregulated private industries, unregulated private interests. And there are a range of policy options, from nationalization of energy supply and the whole energy industry to be managed by the state, to impose in some stages of regulation. And actually, there are no other options to address the energy transition in an organized way, except to regulate or manage it directly.
Thanks very much, Oleh. Colleague panelists, I feel like now is a great time to. We're not going to sum up this conversation because it's gone in so many directions, but I feel like some kind of final reflections are necessary if only to give us some peace of mind about what we've talked about, because obviously this is, you know, two huge connected issues and struggles. Is there anybody who wants to go first? I mean, I have to say, Simon, to an extent, you may have already had your chance for final reflections with your comments on the Don't Pay initiative. But if you do have something very brief to say, I would definitely go back to you. But I feel like perhaps Angelina, you might start us with these kind of final reflections. That would be wonderful. And then Oleh.
Well, I think that has been a far too short discussion of many important topics. And we just, as you said, just scratched upon the surface of so many topics, including from the structure of Russia's like petropower to the need to transform global energy systems. And those are the questions which I also think unite the whole humanity in a way. And those are also the questions which is a big task for all of us who's trying to think how the post-war world will look like and what will be the major tasks for the post-war world. And I feel like I learned a lot from my co-panelists, and I would like to thank them. And yeah, I can just confirm, and I can just say again, I think the argument which I was saying a few minutes ago, that the importance of transforming our energy systems and going away from just a handful of fossil fuel suppliers, be it the countries or be it private companies, and really maybe moving more into community-led resource management systems. And this is something which does seem like a task for the future. And I'm very happy we're having this conversation, and I feel like more are needed. Also the ones which we would analyze the current state of affairs and the major challenges, but also the ones which we would see the future beyond these challenges and the future we want to see.
Thanks so much, Angelina, for joining us and those final reflections from you. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I think definitely a conversation. Yeah, I wonder if our conversation today could have been focused more on the future, perhaps, but I feel like we're still just scratching the surface of the nature of this crisis and trying to understand its exact outline. I have to say, I've learned a lot from this conversation, so I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of our panelists about that, and it certainly made me reflect further. I'd like to go to Oleh now for sort of your final reflections, if that's possible.
Yeah, so I basically agree that we just scratched the surface, and there is actual a huge need to discuss, to engage broader public and the whole of society into reflecting on what is happening, to build your perspective, your understanding, your critical assessment of what is happening, what governments are doing, what the business is doing, and this is a wake-up call for the world. It's a wake-up call for every person to take responsibility for at least your own life, and to be critical of what is happening around you, and not just be like a sheep in the herd and follow the orders, because if you follow the orders, you may end up in a petro state without any human rights or right to define your own future. And I would definitely support Angelina's thought that the future of energy is really in the community-owned infrastructure, when the people, they are in charge of their critical needs, and they are involved in operation of their energy systems. They, for example, they clean up their solar panels, or they invest in wind power cooperatives. They work at the facilities that are powered by their local renewables. So for sure, there is a huge space for everyone to engage in ending the fossil fuel age.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Oleg. I think, yeah, just some important reflections about everyone's own individual responsibility and the kind of positive agenda, in the sense that if you want to have some say in defining your future, you do have to take a deep look at what's going on. Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So just a final thought really jumps immediately off from the point that Oleg made there. I mean, I would say that I go to quite a few meetings and gatherings with people who care about the environment, who worry about the social crisis, who worry about the war. I mean, I very often find myself saying, look, first, we have to question the way that the energy system is set up economically. We've got used to the idea that energy is this commodity which the energy company sells you. Energy is a right, and it should be delivered as a service. And people have it's your responsibility, as Oleg is saying, and you're going to help yourself and your fellow citizens by getting your head around that and imagining ways that whole system could be completely different, which is in our collective power. And the other thing I'd say is that approach also applies to technologies. I mean, what we hear about technologies from the powers that be is that, but whether it's hydrogen or the others that have been mentioned, carbon capture and storage, all these exotic technologies which are supposedly going to decarbonize, but in fact, in those cases are very much part of the survival strategy of oil companies. And we need to develop our own ideas about technology, whether it's these small, simple technologies like insulation, like heat pumps, and so on, whether it's the way that the electricity system is going to look in 20, 30 years' time, whether it's the way that urban transport is going to look in 20 or 30 years' time, or urban building environments are going to have to be completely transformed. And we too can apply our imaginations to those things, and as individuals and collectively, and we should do.
Thanks so much, Simon. Friends, colleagues, audience members, everybody, I think I'm going to close our conversation for this evening here. I have to say I'm not hugely impressed with myself, because I feel like we didn't cover everything, but I know we covered something. And yeah, just to kind of say that once again, I think again the start of a very important conversation we've had here this evening. And I just want to say a huge thank you to our audience members for joining us for this conversation. I feel like I learned something. I hope you did too. And of course, a thank you to our panelists, Simon Pirani, Oleh Savitskyi, and Angelina Davydova for joining us and sharing their expertise. Really a fantastic panel. Couldn't have been better. Please do follow them on social media. Please follow us on social media. All of the links are in the chat, including our panelists' Twitter feeds. And also a special shout out for Angelina's podcast, Eurasian Climate Brief, definitely worth signing up to. And you can also find out information about what everyone's been doing in the chat. There is also a link to Stand With Ukraine, which is Oleh Savitskyi's initiative, which is about trying to end fossil fuel purchases from Russia. Please check it out. And if you haven't already, and you have got spare money, even though we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, please do try donating whatever you can afford to openDemocracy. We would really appreciate it. Even a small amount is a wonderful reminder of the service and the work that we do, which is for you. Thanks again to our panelists, and of course to Anita, our producer, and I wish you all a good evening. Thank you very much.